What's up guys, Tim Rustwick here, and today I want to talk about my experience working in a feature factory. Now this is something I really struggled with in a lot of my development projects, and it's basically the idea that if you work on something, you can end up just making it bigger and more complex and crazier and just pump out features, and you don't actually really produce a whole. And so from my experience specifically, I remember it wasn't a game, but it was a project that I worked on for a long time. You may recognize it, called Game Dev Underground. But when we started in 2013, I had built this thing, and the idea was that I was going to build something for game developers to help market and promote their games. And so I built this basic website, I kind of put it all together, and it was all based on the premise that the landing page was going to be more marketing focused than itch.io or any of these other things, essentially giving a marketing grade landing page directly to game developers without any of the fancy, stuff that some of these other sites have. And when I started on that, it was very clear, like that's what I wanted to do. But as we got people in, we had a very successful launch. We had hundreds of people came in at midnight, and I was just blown away by the support we got, by the recruits that joined. It was awesome. But people started requesting things, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna add this, I'm gonna add a forum, I'm gonna add discussion, I'm gonna add this, I'm gonna add that. And I ended up with social profiles, and I ended up with a news feed. And before I knew it, it had ballooned into a social networking site, really. And I kind of looked at it one day and I was like, holy shit, what did I do? Like, this was not supposed to be that. This was just supposed to be a marketing tool. And I realized that maybe that was kind of the goal from the beginning, because I named it Game Dev Underground. I didn't really name it Game Dev Marketing Tool or something. But the idea, essentially, I ended up working at a feature factory for a year and a half, and I just was pumping out stuff, and I ended up with a big pile of stuff that was just all over the place, and it wasn't good for the user. And I've done this in games as well. I'm working on a roguelike right now for a space roguelike with spaceships and stuff, and I have rewritten the game from scratch twice. And every time I just end up on these long tangents of adding in features and doing these things when I keep forgetting about just getting the whole thing complete, just getting that vertical slice done and getting the game out there and then iterating on it. That's something that I have learned 1,000 times, but it's still something I struggle with, because it's so tempting to just want to work on features and get stuff out there. So there are 3 ways basically that I think you can combat working in a feature factory. Get yourself out of there and make sure that you're productive. The first one is finding the right metric. And what I mean by that is you have to find something that you can measure that will properly determine your success in the setting. So for example, in a game, I think the perfect metric is not the amount of work that I'm doing, but the completion of the vertical slice. Or let's say I have 10 segments that need to be complete before I have a working game. I measure my progress by those 10 segments. So I don't add anything else. I have plenty of ideas, of course. You keep adding your ideas to a notepad or a folder or file or whatever, but you can't just go on tangents and do that stuff. You have to find the right metric and stick to that metric and constantly measure your success by whether or not you're hitting the metric. Right? The milestones, the individual goals and objectives that you set. You have to pick the right goals. You have to pick the right things to measure, or you end up on this crazy wild train. Like, a lot of people don't even measure their progress at all, which is why you end up in this deep, dark pit of game development where nothing gets done, and you've been working on it for 2 years, and sooner or later you just have this giant thing that's not even a full working game, but it's got all these cool features and it's confusing to use, and it's just a nightmare. So number 1 is picking the right metric. Number 2 is similar to that, but it's focusing on outcomes over output. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times developers will say, okay, I had a successful day because I worked for 8 hours on the code, or I had a successful day because I rewrote this whole function section or whatever. And your output does not determine the outcome. You have to focus on the outcome. For me, this was really hard to do in the beginning because I enjoyed working on all these little tangents and features and things that I would go off on little paths to do. I enjoyed building these random little features that I just thought of while playtesting. But if your output is more important than your outcome, you'll never get anywhere. And I think the outcome for any indie developer is probably the vertical slice or the initial prototype or the MVP of the game. You want to get a playable game as soon as possible. That's the outcome. Everything that you should do should be focused on the outcome, not your output for that day or that week or the month, not how long you worked, all that stuff. You got to focus on the outcome. The number three is avoiding shiny object syndrome. And these are all kind of related, right? They're very similar. But shiny object syndrome is, like I mentioned, I would come up with these ideas, and then all of a sudden I would just go off on a tangent like, oh, that's so cool, I want to build that thing. Oh, that's so cool, I want to build that thing. Sometimes it was simple and small, and it was shiny object syndrome inside a game. Like I would get excited about new features and just abandon the old one and go on to the new one. Sometimes it was entire games, right? Like I would start this game and like, oh, it's so awesome, I can't wait to make this, and then I would just abandon it and go on to the next one. Oh, that game's so awesome, I can't wait to make it. And I would just hop from shiny object to shiny object. That is the number one killer of all indie games. And when it happens inside your game, there are so many things that can go wrong. There are so many like danger areas, especially on a longer term project, that will just demotivate you and kill your motivation and just end up making you quit or hating your project or get burned out or any of that stuff. And you don't want that to happen. So make sure that you're not working in a feature factory. I know it's hard. I know it's when you love something like game development and you just want to sit down after a long day or even during a long day and just make a game or work on something. Some of us use it as this type of therapy. Some of us, it's more of a hobby. Some of us, it's a business. And you got to make sure that you are getting somewhere, that you're progressing. And feature factories, they don't go anywhere. They just are never-ending amounts of work. They're constantly growing in scope and scale, and even though you work on them, they don't get anywhere. So if you do those three things, right? If you find the right metric, if you focus on outcomes, not output, and you avoid shiny objects, I think you'll do well. It's worked for me. I still have to remind myself, like, no matter how many games I make, even though I know this stuff conceptually, even though I've done this stuff, I've worked on myself to the point where I have to remember this stuff. I still have to write it down. I have sticky notes on my computer. I have to remind myself of this stuff. So it's not easy, but it's effective. And when you want to be a game developer, the number one thing standing between you and that is a finished game. So you want to focus on that and avoid feature factories as much as you can. If you have any comments on this, leave them below. I want to hear what you have to say. Once again, I'm Tim Ruswick, and I will see you guys in the next video.